All right, welcome back. Lesson 6 or week 6, lesson 2. As promised, today we're going to talk about faith. Keep sliding down in my chair. Faith and how it leads us to obedience and how it undergirds, everything that we do. As the engine of faith, to continue that analogy, fueled by the Holy Spirit and the knowledge of who God is through Bible study and just awareness of who he is, as that begins to catapult us and lead us into maturity in Jesus, just behind faith, we find obedience. Now, unfortunately, some believe that having faith without any actual obedience is all that's needed. But the scriptures would actually beg to differ. In Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verse 1, the writer spells it out very clearly. And that verse says, love the Lord your God and always keep his mandate and his statutes, ordinances, and commands. Over in the New Testament, James takes it actually a little further in James 1 and verse 22, and he calls us to be doers of the word and not hearers only. He goes on in chapter 2 and verse 17, he says, actually without action, without obedience, that our faith isn't even real. He says in the same way, faith, if it does not have works, is dead by itself. As you and I grow in our faith in God and we are learning more and more and more about his nature and his character, it actually follows that we would seek to be like him. The more we know of him, the more we're going to want to be like him. And that's exactly what he's asking us to do. We've talked about this several times, is as we get to know him and be with him, to then be like him, to think like him, to feel like him, and then to live and walk in the righteousness of Jesus. Now, I'm glad as we share this, that his righteousness, the big term is imputed, or it's placed over us, because we don't have any righteousness of our own, the scriptures tell us, but his is imputed. And one of the ways I like to illustrate that is if you put your jacket or your coat onto someone else and it covered them, you have imputed your warmth, you've imputed your clothing onto them, you've placed it over them. And that's how Jesus' righteousness works with us. The Holy Spirit, which indwells all of us as believers, empowers our obedience, and it makes our practical everyday lives begin to fall in line with the nature and the character of God's will. Paul says this in Romans 6 and verse 16. He says that if you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, that you are slaves of that one you obey, either of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness. He just lays it out here. He's like, it's the one to whom you are responsible, the one that you serve, the one that you're giving allegiance to, is the one that you actively obey. And so we can, with our mouths, give allegiance and talk about following Jesus, but if we're not willing to obey him, then our actions betray that our profession is lacking. And I'm not here to say, you're saved or not saved. I'm just saying that according to Paul, we're slaves to the thing that we obey, whether it's sin unto death and destruction, or whether it's God unto life and restoration. In John's first epistle, or his letter, not the Gospel of John, but in 1 John, he speaks about obedience, and this obedience being the result of knowing God. That's why we start with knowing God. In 1 John chapter 2, verse, I believe it's 3 and 4, he says that our obedience, and I would even say that our willingness to be obedient to his commands, is the litmus test. It's the proof that we actually know who God is. And this is not begrudging submission and begrudging obedience. It's a willing heart of obedience. We know if you have children that you don't just seek their compliance when you give them rules and regulations. What you want is their heart. You want their heart to want to do well. And that's what John's trying to teach us here, is that the litmus test, the proof that we actually know who God is our willingness and our action in obeying him. And he says in the verse, this is how we know that we know him. I mean, that's a pretty clear sentence. If we keep his commandments. The one who says, I have come to know him, and yet doesn't keep his commandments is a liar, and it says the truth isn't in him. And I know these are hard words and kind of harsh to read, but they help paint a picture of just how important obedience to God really is. But it's not like a legalistic obedience, which means, you check off all the right boxes, check off all the right items on our religious checklist. It's a deeper and more meaningful relationship than that. It's literally how we show our love to Jesus, not unlike how a child shows affection and love for the parents by simply doing what they say without grumbling, and they just do it. John records in his gospel that Jesus thought the same thing. In John 14 and verse 15, you could also go to 2 John 1:6, but in John 14:15, he says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." So as we're pursuing obedience, though, we've got to be careful not to equate religious ritual with what he's meaning here. And the prophet Samuel tells us in 1 Samuel 15:22, he says it this way: "Does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord?" Look, to obey is better than sacrifice. To pay attention is better than the fat of rams. The other way I would put it like this is like, it's better for us to do what he says than to do a bunch of religious stuff. The easiest human thing that you and I can do is to attempt to define exactly what commands that we should be sure to obey as a result of our faith. But surely every word in the scriptures is important to this task of our walking in maturity with Jesus. You know why? Because Jesus himself cleared it up fairly well. He told us that this is the way it is. In a previous lesson, we talked about in Mark chapter 12, we talked about this, and we can read it again here. And it says, one of the scribes approaching Jesus. And it says, when he heard them debating and saw that Jesus answered them well, he asked him, which command is the most important of all? Which ones carry the big weight? Is this the big 10? What do we mean to make sure we're doing? And Jesus answered, the most important is, listen, Israel. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. That's the most important thing. We got to love God, and to love him, we got to know him. And then he says the second is love your neighbor as yourself. And it says there's no other command greater than these. And he says, once again, you can see exactly how serious Jesus is about these two commandments. I think he really means what he's saying here. And Paul does too in Romans 1:5. He kind of summarizes all of this for us. The goal is to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among the Gentiles. Sometimes we think that being in obedience to God's ultimate response or ultimate goal is for us to be saved and be right with God. That's part of it. That's good. But according to Paul, the ultimate goal of our knowing God, having faith in God, loving God, and then being obedient is so that his name is made great amongst those that don't know him. I don't know when it happened, but somewhere over the last 2,000 years, since Jesus was here, we've engaged in an effort to propagate the good news of the gospel, which is good and right. But somewhere along the line, we separated the idea of obedience to Jesus' commands from the faith that's required to know him in salvation, as if we could be saved by faith and then just not be obedient, and as long as we're in, it's okay. But the scriptures just speak of this in a different way. Not in a legalistic way, you've got to do everything so you can earn your salvation. But he says, if you're saved and if you love God, it will come out in obedience. There's an analogy of a wedding that I like to put out. We used it in another lesson. If the moment of faith unto salvation is the wedding ceremony, that's the moment in time where we pledged our allegiance to one another in marriage. Let's just say salvation's like that. That's the moment in time. Then obedience would be representational of this daily life of a husband and a wife making their way through life, learning about each other, submitting to one another, growing with one another, becoming one with one another. There was two before. For the believer, the big theological word there is sanctification. It literally describes the path where we're being transformed into the image of Jesus. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to take your newly honed Bible skills that we've been working with. I want you to study the following passages in these questions that are below, answer the discussion questions that follow, and then answer a couple of your classmates, and let's start some discussion about what you and I are learning through these passages. We'll see you in the next video.